Farmers this year had a fairly good year at the Rhode Island General Assembly. After many years of trying to get the inheritance tax bill passed, we finally got it through this year. The bill that we had passed says that farmland should be appraised as farmland. Prior to this bill being passed, if you inherited farmland, the farmland was inherited at its highest and best use, which is usually house lots. We kept telling the Rhode Island General Assembly, if you keep appraising farmland as house lots, they're going to become house lots. Because what happens is, the farmer who has an average size farm of say 50 acres has the land appraised at its highest and best use, which I say is house lots, and that means the land would probably be appraised at about $5 million. And that means the farmer would have to pay an inheritance tax of about $500,000. Now where's the average farmer going to get $500,000? Well, the answer is pretty simple. They've got to sell part of the farmland in order to pay for that inheritance tax. So we were trying to persuade the General Assembly, like I say, for several years, that the farmland should be appraised as farmland. Now if you take that same farm of about 50 acres and appraise it as farmland, then it's worth about $600,000. And there is a $1 million cap, basically, on the inheritance tax, a $1 million threshold, if you will. If your property that you inherit is worth less than $1 million, you don't have to pay any inheritance tax. So by appraising the farmland as farmland, instead of at its highest and best use, you go from owing $500,000 in an inheritance tax to owing $600,000. I'm sorry, to having property appraised at $600,000, which means no inheritance tax is due. So the bill was passed as part of the budget, and I had some concerns about that because I said, what does that mean? Every year we have to go through this and put it into the budget? But Representative Eileen Norton, who was on the Finance Committee, assured me that this bill is permanent, and as permanent as you can get in state government. In other words, next year we don't have to have the inheritance tax bill passed again. It's that if the General Assembly decides they don't like the idea of appraising farmland as farmland, they would have to take it out. And it's usually pretty hard to take something out once it's in. So I'm pretty confident that this legislation will be permanent. So from now on, farmland in Rhode Island will be appraised as farmland. There's another interesting development that we had happen at the General Assembly this year. A couple of years ago, we had legislation passed that said that plant agriculture was allowed in all zones. In other words, it didn't matter whether it was an industrial zone, whether it was a residential zone, whatever kind of zone it was, plant agriculture was allowed, and that bill passed. Well, this past year we introduced legislation that said that animal agriculture should be allowed in all zones where you have 10 or more contiguous acres. So we asked DEM for their opinion on the bill, and they said that they interpreted the right to farm law to protect all agriculture, including animal agriculture. So let me quote to you exactly what the right to farm law says. This is Title 2, Chapter 2-23, Section 223(5), Part B. In addition, no city or town ordinance adopted under 23-19.2-1 shall be enforced against any agricultural operation defined in this chapter. So it's saying cities and towns cannot pass laws against farms defined in this chapter. And it says, as a definition of agricultural operations, as used in this chapter, agricultural operations includes any commercial enterprise which has as its primary purpose horticulture, viticulture, floriculture, forestry, stabling of horses, dairy farming, or aquaculture, or the raising of livestock. As a result of DEM having this interpretation of the right to farm law that animal agriculture is basically allowed in all zones already because of the right to farm law, we withdrew the bill. And it remains to be seen whether or not cities and towns are going to try to challenge this right to farm law. There is a case pending right now in Rhode Island Superior Court, and we'll see what happens.